So to kick off, the reason I've asked you for your smartphones is that not only do we allow you to ask questions of myself, but also we have some questions for you, of course. Hopefully you might have used Mentimeter before. So the simplest thing for you to do is just point your camera at the QR code and that will take you through to the Mentimeter question directly. So key question, as is obvious sort of to start. And if you don't have a phone, Helen has very kindly put a link into the chat. I'll introduce both of us in a minute as well. So while you're thinking about the answer to your questions, basically some of my background for those that don't know me, I'm a senior estates project specialist for NHS Devon, but I'm also actually here as co-chair of the Healthcare Project and Change Association's Equality, Diversion and Inclusion Network, or HPCA EDI, as we all love acronyms in the NHS. And I know there are some of my EDI colleagues on the call, so welcome again and thank you for the support here. Also like to introduce Helen Bellis, who will be staying in the background and basically doing all the things in the background that really support. She'll also be monitoring the chat as well, so make sure that if I do miss anything that I'll get a prompt from her. Basically my background is I've worked across commercial, voluntary and public sectors, joined NHS Devon in 2022. Prior to that, I was working for Devon County Council, where I project managed a Learn Devon programme that was really about discussing with employers the benefits of employing people with disabilities, and that was all types of disability. And one of the things that fascinated me when talking to employers is they would instantly go to the physical disability, the more obvious disability. And it was only through sort of discussion and increasing awareness that I would get people to think about the benefits of those disabilities that are hidden, that are invisible. I continued that a bit more when I joined the ICB, because I supported the programme to introduce the Oliver McGowan mandatory training programme for better awareness of neurodiversity and learning disabilities. And that was developing the programme across the whole county. I'm very delighted to see that how it is spreading across the county now. And I think I'll say hello to Laura on the call as well, who's doing a great job of continuing to lead this programme out with us as well. So very grateful for that. And hopefully you will all be doing a session in Oliver McGowan sometime in the next couple of years, I would think. So back to the question. Essentially, as I say, if you've got an answer there, Helen, do we have
we do. And
any results for that?
I can share my screen if you like. Would that be helpful?
Yep, I will quickly stop sharing. And there we go. So we're looking at sort of pretty even across the board, conscious that obviously there's not many of us in the call, so it sort of has a greater effect on it, but delighted to see that there are colleagues there with invisible conditions who are happy to say that they have one. And I will actually sort of refer to that a bit more in a minute. So if I come back to sharing my screen. And I apologise as well that I'm sounding slightly croaky. I'm sure this is psychosomatic whenever I do a presentation, but I do have plenty of liquid beside me, sadly without gin, to keep me going. So hopefully the voice will last while we're doing this. So really sort of to kick off, I love this quote by cricketer Yuvraj Singh when he was sort of brand ambassador and he'd been a hero in his country, of just stating the obvious of don't judge a disability by its visibility. And really, it's how I challenge people to say, we all assume that we're not judgmental people by the nature of what we do, but of course that we do have unconscious biases that will sneak out and impact what we're thinking and what we're doing. So hopefully some of the elements of what I cover in this presentation will make you sort of think about what it is for people, that just to make sort of a bit more aware, and maybe some situations that you won't have met or you won't have had covered. I stress I am not clinical or medical by background. I'm actually a project manager and a marketeer for my sins. So I'm sort of talking about sort of coming at this with lived experience. And as part of that, I do stress that not all of us have a lanyard to make it really obvious. Although I think the sunflower lanyards are absolutely brilliant. But obviously there's always the political debate about whether you want the label, don't want the label, whether you want something to be obvious or not. And the key thing is, under the Equalities Act, which is 15 years old now, all of us actually have the legal right to not declare our condition or our disability. And I'll sort of bring that element up a bit later on in the session when we talk about reasonable adjustments. What I will say is I'm quite happy to talk about the conditions I have, because I have lived experience. I actually have 3 hidden conditions. And for those who don't know me, you can have fun trying to guess what they are, because I will be giving out clues during the session. But for those who do know me, you probably know already, as I will have told you. So if you can sort of keep that back to the end of the session, and we'll take it from there. So before we do actually start, I do have trigger warnings for you. Because this is interactive and I do use videos to actually describe some of the elements, there are some aspects that might trigger if you've got a sensitivity. And there is actually one example as we go through that triggers myself. So it's a case of what I will do is actually give you a warning before that. And I do have these yellow triangles actually on the slide just to give you a heads up as well. And I will tell you how long the video is likely to last. I think they're usually about a minute at the longest anyway. So if you want to sort of step away, take your headphones off or mute the computer, please do, because obviously we don't want anybody to come to any harm at all or have anything triggered by that. But yeah, it's always the warning from there. So starting off with some facts and figures for you. Getting you to think about hidden conditions from a starting point that the Equality Act actually, and I've got to read this because I can never remember the exact description, defines a disability, and we're talking about all disabilities here, as a person who has a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Of course, that's nice and clear, isn't it? With the joys of legal language, it's always the difficulty of nothing is actually in plain English, which is something I'm always fighting for. And I think within the Equality Act, it does say sort of examples of impairment means long-term medical conditions such as asthma and diabetes, or fluctuating or progressive conditions. And then there is a whole list of sort of other conditions that it might cover. It defines substantial as more than minor or trivial, which really doesn't clarify it much for me at all. But long term does mean actually having a condition for 12 months or more. And this usually takes an effect when you're looking at requirements through, say, DWP, for example, when you're looking for support mechanisms that need to be put in place under reasonable adjustments. So a lot of the time there is a specific definition when you have to put in an application for that. And I can point people to the right direction if you want to know more about that, as I have colleagues who know far more about it than I do. But for the purpose of this session, I'm going to be looking at conditions that are not immediately obvious. So as well as those sort of listed there, going into more detail, we can look at sort of obviously including mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, personality disorders, or you've got the cognitive impairments such as dementia, traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, learning difficulties, which is technically not a disability. You have physical health conditions that are not obvious, such as those creating chronic pain, or respiratory conditions, or things such as diabetes, incontinence, all of those elements. And obviously there are neurological conditions that can be sort of come and go in effect. And there's a whole list of them that I'm sure you're far more aware of than I am. But the key thing is thinking about how they might be energy limiting conditions as well, especially since COVID. I think there's been far greater awareness of that. And it's sort of all these elements that come out in the wash in effect. But the key thing is that there's no sort of obvious physical evidence of what a condition may be. And bear in mind that the conditions can cover obviously permanent, life-changing conditions, but also it's worth thinking, certainly as we're looking at this element from sort of project management and change management perspective, that sort of temporary conditions that might impact how you're delivering something or how something could be delivered to you. So there's sort of episodic conditions that we need to think about, or just good old-fashioned injury and illness. That depending on sort of the nature of it or severity of it might have quite a big impact. And one of the key ones, particularly for me, is situational conditions, because whether it's sort of background noise, whether it's light and darkness, but one of the big ones that I talk to a lot about to people is digital access. Because particularly aware that in this time when we're doing our best to try and save as much money as possible, there is an element of digital is a very cost-effective way. But how can that actually impair other people if they don't have digital access, either through lack of knowledge of using digital systems or by the fact they just can't get good broadband? So is all those sort of elements that come into it as well. So hidden disabilities aren't necessarily within the body. They can be around you and part of the environment, part of the situation that we're working with. And of course, one of the key things is that putting that statistic down the bottom that I find often surprises people, because we think often of disabilities as you are born with a condition. But actually, the vast majority of people with disabilities actually acquire them during their lives. And as the example I give, I actually have 3 hidden conditions, one of which I was born with, 2 of which I have acquired during various times in my life. So it's that element of, it's that complex mixture of conditions that people often have, because as we all well know, it's rare that we just have one or the other of something. And for those who know me, they know I'm a bit of a stats nerd, so need to do some stats for you. Starting with a fairly obvious one of neurodivergency. At the moment, I think these stats I got from an article actually written by the Institute of Accountants in England and Wales, that they reckon that 1 in 5 equates to about 13 million people, including 700,000 people with the autism spectrum condition. And basically, that's one of the reasons the Oliver McGowan mandatory training is so vital, because when you think for those of us likely to come in contact with patients, if 1 in 5 people have a neurodivergent condition, then that's something we need to be far more aware of. And obviously, neurodivergence is quite a wide range that can include sort of hyperactivity, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. And what I will stress is within this webinar, I won't be going into neurodivergence purely because I actually have colleagues in Wales who will be delivering a session later on in the year. So they will be providing much greater detail on that. So as I mentioned very briefly, I will stick with the sensory hidden disabilities to cover from that. Another key one in 3 adults in the UK is either deaf or has hearing loss. And again, I was getting this for the Royal National Institute for the Deaf. They were saying that actually for people aged 55 or over, that's more than half of the population will have a hearing loss. And bearing in mind what the average age tends to be within the NHS ICBs, that's worth thinking about when we're looking at sort of working with colleagues to think, do they necessarily hear instructions? Have I checked my understanding that they've heard? Those sort of issues. And as we get older, for those over 70, that hearing loss increases to over 80% of adults over 70. So the other quote they have here is that the RNID estimates that about 1.2 million adults have hearing loss severe enough that they would not be able to hear conversational speech. So again, if somebody keeps asking you to repeat something, please be patient with them. It may just be that they are actually trying to get the connections through and properly understand what they can hear. One of the key things, 1 in 4 experience mental health problem. Quite frankly, I think with the life that we're all leading at the moment and having gone through COVID, coming out of the pandemic, that's probably a low estimate now. So again, it's something like that that we need to be aware of with work in project management, particularly with working with people, is to make sure that they are all mentally and physically in a safe environment as we're working with them. Some stats that I hadn't really thought about, but have been interested in reading from the, I think it was the Institute of Pain Management, that actually 43% of adults now live with a degree of chronic pain. And again, that is one of the biggest hidden disabilities. So it's a case of, again, seeing the sort of how common these conditions are for us. And with the general element of sort of so many of us having long-standing health conditions, and obviously the fact that we're talking often about multi-conditions, that we don't just sort of have a singular element to there. And the fact that nearly 5 million people have an energy limiting condition that really will affect what they can do within a working environment. And I'll look at that in a bit more in the upcoming slides. So it's really to say that sort of just thinking about the lived experience and the nature of what we do within the NHS in particular, especially within the project and change management process, that it's really about sort of thinking about enhancing our knowledge and really getting to know people with lived experience for them to share their experience if they're happy to do so. Because it's, as you know, it's always about living from the other person's perspective to see sort of how we can help them, what we can do with them. And then really it's about sort of how do we enable reasonable adjustments and take through from there. I've just seen a request and breaking off slightly. Helen, can you put the Menti code in the chat again, please? Because I think somebody else needed it and couldn't get it from the phone. So Helen will put that back in. The other thing to think about, of course, with reasonable adjustments, and I will discuss this in a section a bit later on, is one of the key issues, as I mentioned, is it's not a legal requirement for anybody to disclose that they have a disability. But it is a legal requirement if they have disclosed under the Equality Act for a reasonable adjustment to be applied if it is required. So there's a slight conundrum here of how do we look at reasonable adjustments in the workplace if somebody hasn't declared. So I'll leave that as a sort of a hanging question for you that we will come back to. So are there any sort of questions just from sort of that introductory, or any comments that hit you about the statistics? Hopefully there's nothing that's too big a surprise from that, but it's sort of always worth sort of referring back to them just to really see sort of how common our conditions are. Okay, I'll move on then to give you some examples of invisible disabilities. And again, covering a sort of fairly wide range. We'll cover couple sort of fairly quickly, and then, as I say, there are some videos coming up as well for you. So one of the early examples is within the element of dyslexia. I have got this, I'm very grateful for this tool, and if you bear with me while I get it going, it actually gives an example of what it is for people who have dyslexia, of what life can be like for them when they are trying to make sense of written language, whether it's on a website, whether it's in a document, with the sort of nature of what you have to do. So some of the examples we've been given from people with lived experience is thinking about how you can make life a little bit easier for everybody. And it's key things like in documents of using sans serif fonts like Arial or Calibri. So sans serif just simply means without a tail. So it's the fonts that are plainer. And if you tend to use small text in documents, please don't, because it's a lot easier if you're starting with 12 or 14 size font. That makes it sort of easier for people to read for everybody. Also, if you differentiate headings within a document, that can make things easier. If you have a slightly bigger interword spacing, it's all things like that that just sort of make it easier for somebody with dyslexia, but of course actually makes it easier for everybody to read. And there are various tools available. Again, we can give you links to them that can actually show you how much to sort of do that with. And move on. And actually on screen is an example of somebody has developed a font called Open Dyslexic that weights the bottom of the font, the bottom of the letters, to actually enable it to be a bit clearer. But linked to that, just generally, we do tend to make an assumption about reading ages often, especially in project management, when you think some of the documents we're going to be providing are going to be technical specifications or things that are actually fairly detailed. But the sad state of affairs is that what we've got is an average age of 11 is the typical reading age of a UK adult at the moment. And within the diagram there, it's sort of just giving you an example of if you're a reader of The Sun, typically that is a literary age of about 8 years old equivalent. If you're a reader of The Guardian, you typically got the age of 14-year-old. So it sort of shows the sort of different examples, and you can tell just by the content of the different type of newspapers. The key thing is sort of what they would quote an 11 to 12-year-old to be able to do from a literacy perspective is that you can develop opinions through inference skills. So you can actually re-examine text and take it through. You can compare how texts are presented. You can sort of identify multi-purpose texts. And you can use sort of visual elements to apply. But actually, that's the limiting factor within it. So it's a case of one of the dangers we will have, because obviously most of us are either fairly well educated, university educated, further qualifications. The danger we've got is, do we make things more complicated? And those of my colleagues who know me will know I have a really big thing about using abbreviations all the time, because the number of times I'm in presentations, and I've worked for the NHS for nearly 3 years, and there are still abbreviations being used that I go, really don't know what you're talking about. Because the obvious thing is, when we're looking at a particular aspect of work, we might think this set of abbreviations explain what we do, but of course they don't. My main problem I had when I first came into the public sector was everybody kept talking about SMEs, and I'm going, well, I know them as small and medium-sized enterprises, and it was quite a shock to realise that they were required, I think, it's specialist experience. There is a particular phrase, and it's just gone totally out of my head. But the fact that it's the small and medium-sized enterprises is what will go through to me first of all. So it's the key question or key request I have. Subject matter experts. Thank you, Heather. Just one of those things where I'm trying to do too many things at the same time and it just goes straight out of the brain. So it's that element where whenever you're explaining something, please put the full description in first, and obviously that you can join as you go through. And yeah, Heather, you have the same problem as me, that people make the expectation that we should know what all the abbreviations in the NHS mean, and most of the time we don't. So moving on from then, so looking at some of the visual elements that people have. Colour blindness, which is an easy one. And I have to say, I was really pleased from anybody who's a sports fan. The rugby fans this last Saturday, to see that the Irish team had particularly thought about colour blindness, because of course their natural colour is a green jersey and they were playing Wales, which is a natural colour of a red jersey. And of course the most common form of colour blindness is red-green. So they actually did change their sort of shirt colour. I noticed the white shirts did have sort of a little shade of green in it, just to sort of maintain the fact that it's sort of sticking to the true colours there. But on the screen, actually, it does give you examples from a website that I used to use, that basically shows you the different types of colour blindness that you can have. The most common one is obviously red-green, and I think that's sort of like 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women, because we do tend to assume it is mostly men that have colour blindness, will have the red, green and yellow combinations. So they tend to often appear as brown, and red can be perceived as black. So that's the sort of difficulty that creates. There is a slightly rarer form, which is tritanopia. I think that's how we correct it. Any clinical people might be able to correct me on that. And that is the blue-yellow colour blindness. And that sort of, again, will make colours look less bright, and it's able to tell the difference between the sort of blues and greens, the purples and the reds, and the yellows and pinks that they struggle with there. There is actually, I've been led to believe, an even rarer condition, which is a complete colour blindness, which is monochromacy or chromacy, and that will sort of create an element where you literally have no colour. Sadly, I don't have stats on that, but I gather it is fairly rare. One of the great things I was able to do is sort of sit through some data training sessions, and absolutely brilliant to see the SPC charts, which I know are becoming the way of working within the NHS. Rather than our red, amber, green RAG routines, we're now looking at the statistical process control charts, and they will use blues and oranges instead of red and green. So again, it's seeping into the everyday life to just sort of think about how can we make these changes easier for everybody. And it's the fact that it works for all of us, not just for those people with the particular condition. Obvious, fairly common one. This always makes my eyes look slightly fuzzy. As you can tell, I'm a glasses wearer. I'm short-sighted. I have the fun bit, of course, that it's never that simple, that I have to have different pairs of glasses, depending on whether I'm looking at a computer or whether I'm looking at distance, all the joys of that. But one of the key things is obviously being aware of, again, as we're working with people, is how do we make things clearer for everybody to make life simpler for them. I include macular degeneration, even though that is something that typically will impact older people in our society. But we are talking about probably 1.5 million people in the UK who are likely to have age-related macular degeneration, AMD, because that's the most sort of common cause of sight loss in this country. So there are sort of plenty of sort of support tools and software and things like that. So really just sort of set you off with, because I've been talking for a while, getting your fingers working in the chat. What sort of predictive measures in project management do you think that we can add from support for sight loss elements or sight restrictive elements when working in an environment that can actually be useful for everybody? Fairly simple examples to see sort of how we go through. We don't, because whilst you do have complicated software, a lot of the time reasonable adjustments just take something very simple. So what do you think you could put there? Yes, thank you, Carol. Yeah, good lighting levels is an easy one. Though we obviously need to be mindful for some people that actually strong lighting, especially with glaucoma, can actually make it more difficult for people if it's too bright. So again, there's always an opposite effect. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Julie. Talking to people who are with the lived conditions and getting their input, especially when we're looking at sort of design and construction elements to it. Reading back text, yeah, turn it audio, because the number of times of not just reading aloud and alt text, but if we've got documents and things, sometimes it's an awful lot easier just to do a quick audio recording of them, because we live in a world where we're multitasking all the time. And I have to admit, I've now moved from being an avid book reader to pretty much an avid listener, as I listen to podcasts, audio books, that sort of thing. So it's sort of the whole world is sort of changing around us. Yeah, thank you, Linda. Clear pictorial signage. It's a sort of making things obvious, because again, back to the literacy element, if people are struggling to read something, can we actually do something that an image will help? Because again, thinking of, do we assume that everybody has English as a native language? Not necessarily. Yeah, thank you, Julie, again. Yeah, flashing lights for fire alarm systems. So there's obviously something in place that actually makes it clear, because the number of people that, considering how loud fire alarms are, that people have accounts of how they've slept through fire alarms because they literally didn't hear them. So there's lots of sort of elements there as well. So thank you for those ideas. So having mentioned sound and fire alarms, I will move on to hearing awareness. What I have got to just do is stop sharing, because I just realised, as Helen had instructed me to, I forgot to press a button. So I will redo this so that you can hear. And as you will see, there is a yellow trigger warning. This is a short video of about a minute. So if you need to step out of it, that's all you need to do. And I'll give you a clue to one of my hidden conditions. I am going to be taking my headphones off because this definitely triggers me. So what this is examples of different forms of tinnitus, just to give those of you lucky enough not to have tinnitus, actually what it sounds like. So hopefully that's given you enough time to take your headphones off if you need to. And I will play this. As I say, it's just over a minute long.
People often ask me, what's it like having tinnitus? Well, This is mine.
Hi, my name's Jeff, and this is my tinnitus.
My name is Lynette. This is my tinnitus.
Hello, my name is Zachary, and this is what my tinnitus sounds like.
My name is Sue, and this is my tinnitus.
My name is Rochelle, and this is my tinnitus.
I always love that section where it says tinnitus has no borders except in how you pronounce tinnitus, with our sort of Canadian colleague there who calls it tinnitus. Hopefully that gives you an example, and I'm sure most of you will have had tinnitus at some point, whether you've been to sort of something that's particularly loud. The key thing about it is, for the vast majority of people, thankfully, it is temporary, but it's that sort of element again that it can create an interference mechanism for people if they're trying to listen to you, so taking it through there. So what I've got next as it goes through is just need to check that's that. I'm going to play very short video twice. The first time I will play it without sound, so it's really to give you sort of a sense of what it is for somebody who has complete deafness, but also just to see how your lip reading ability is as we go from there, to have a guess at what he's saying. Let me click that. So again, it's one of those things that a lot of us will lip read naturally, but of course the sounds we're hearing is what makes sense of it. So hopefully you will see sort of the difference you have when you have no auditory example of what's being said. And the one thing that does make me laugh is hearing back from sort of colleagues who have hearing loss or severe hearing loss. And the classic thing that people will do if they think they're lip reading is over enunciate when they're talking to you, which actually really doesn't help, because if you are used to lip reading, changing the shape of the mouth actually makes it far more difficult. And of course, the other classic thing is people who will shout to try and help you understand or hear. And if you do have hearing loss, that doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. So again, it's about people's behaviors in reaction to people when they're dealing with it. But one of the other key things that people will have to cope with, and I'll turn the sound up for this, is often not just hearing loss, but actually sound interference. So this might give you an example.
I'm speaking to you, but I'm not, because I'm gonna edit it. You understand it? And this is a little bit strange. But as with anything in life, practice makes perfect. And this is a skill set that you can totally learn. Anybody can learn this. Now, I know for sure that I have not always been this comfortable speaking to a camera. You can check. I'm speaking to you.
So again, it's sort of giving you different examples of really sort of, from a hearing loss perspective, the wide range of conditions that people will have to deal with. And thank you, Katie, for sharing Yes, it can, and I'm afraid I'm guilty of tending to sort of throw my arms around when I'm presenting. I'm even worse when I'm presenting face to face, I will admit. But it's all those distractions that if you are trying to actually concentrate on something, because one of the comments I will make is I've referred previously to sort of energy limiting conditions. And most people will think of sort of a physical condition that limits your energy. But for me, it's when you're having to sort of compensate for whether it's some form of sensory loss, that all takes energy. And depending on what you're trying to do, it's often people won't appreciate, because you won't be showing any symptoms of it, just how much additional energy you are having to use in order sort of to make yourself clear or to be able to take information on board from people. So that's why it's sort of a key thing to understand from somebody else's perspective. It's not just they have sight loss or they have hearing loss or they have chronic pain. It is all the effects that has when trying to sort of cope with that condition. Any comments from what you've seen and heard within that? Any impact on what it has done within your working life? Glad that was interesting for you. Yeah. Hopefully it gives you this sort of sense of what it feels like for people to actually experience it, because it's always the difficult element of when people are trying to explain, but unless you've actually felt the sort of sense of it, and it's always that element of what it does to you next. And yeah, thank you, Nicole. Yeah, sound can impact understanding. It's just if there's interference going on or what situation's going on, especially for all of us, if we've got background noise. I work in an open plan office, and if there's a lot of chatter, unless it's that classic party situation where somebody says your name, and it's amazing how you can attenuate to that straight away. But for a lot of the time, if it's just a sort of a hubbub in the background, that's fine. But I have had sort of days where if it's a busy office, I literally have to put headphones on just to try and shut out the background noise. And yes, there's quite a few of you realizing you can't lip read. It's worth sort of trying to learn how to do it, but it's that sort of element of it, that it is that difficulty of going, if you don't have the other clues as to what is being said. And yeah, paying attention when to things that aren't clear, it really does drain you of energy as you're going through. So absolutely agree with the comments there, and thank you all for your comments to it. So reasonable adjustments, sort of quick session on that, as I'm conscious of time, but a second Menti question for you. This will create a word cloud. So what we'd like you to do is, if you scan for question 2, it's basically, what does the term reasonable adjustment mean to you? If you can't put it into Menti, then please add it into the chat as to what you think. So what are the key terms do you think reasonable adjustment actually means? And I've obviously been sort of referred to it. Oh, yes, Matt, that's not a pleasant gift that keeps on giving, is it, for go through? It's sort of long COVID has impact on an awful lot of things there. And thank you, Helen, for putting that up. Takes a little while for them to come through. Yeah, providing a level playing field, and it is about support. I'm glad somebody has put the term reasonable in there, because that is often where it gets really contentious, of what is reasonable for one person may not be reasonable for another. And yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Equity over equality absolutely is what it's all about. But sort of thinking about reasonable adjustments. One of the key sort of issues that I referred to briefly earlier on is the fact that the danger we have, because we aren't legally obliged to declare, is if you have somebody in a workplace that does not want to declare their disability but needs a reasonable adjustment, how would you cope with that? And often that the key thing to it is that a common situation will be that somebody will declare their disability just to their line manager, but they want to keep it confidential. And I agree with you, Lisa, that reasonable adjustments can be down to manager's discretion, but actually it's a bit wider than that, because there is that legal element that if somebody has disclosed it, then there's a legal requirement to support where you can. And that's where the term reasonable gets into the sort of slightly contentious element, because often from an individual's perspective and an employer's perspective, they will have different descriptions of that. So yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for occupational health. They really do help out with that element to it as well. But one of the key things from project management is to think about actually what can be put in place that will enable everybody to benefit from an easier working environment. And in that situation, you won't then actually be singling out anybody. So sometimes it's just about taking a bit of lateral thinking that doesn't necessarily require an expensive change within the workplace. It can be just sort of something very simple. But it's about that sort of that element within for individuals that's key for people. So I will go back to sharing. And key comment I will make, and just to give you a quick giggle with the cartoon, that quite frankly, how close to the reality is that? Especially when I have a conversation with my line manager today and he admitted how many unread emails he had in his inbox. The key thing to all of this is just to literally put yourself in the other person's shoes where you can. And obviously that's not necessarily always easy, but it is about being on the receiver's wavelength and taking it through from that perspective. And as I've mentioned before, the energy usage, that's key. One of the sort of elements that reasonable adjustments can be, that just from a very human perspective, just to make you think, well, actually, how do we change this? What else can we do? Can I be aware of actually sort of how much energy somebody needs to do that? Within sort of project and change perspective, when we're doing documents, things like that, you may not have particularly noticed the background colors on the presentation. But actually, if you have pure black text on a bright white background, Matt, me too, I miss Daily Dill, but that actually that can be quite fatiguing for everybody. So if you've got a sort of a presentation, a recommendation is to use this sort of charcoal color, which I will see if I can highlight. Zoom into the slide. There you go. That charcoal is a dark grey off black colour that actually just it makes life a little bit easier for people. And if you can then use a slightly off-white text or a pale cream yellow, that again makes a difference. So you can see from the screen, actually it's much easier to read that box on the bottom than it is the sort of the black against the white. So it's simple changes like that that we can require. And again, I can include links and send links to anybody if you want more information about that as well. And just finally, not something that will impact us directly, but is worth thinking about. Even though we are outside the European Union, but if we are working with anybody from Europe, or if any of our services are used across there. You have the European Accessibility Act that is coming into force this year, and it is very wide-ranging because it literally is looking at all digital products and services. So we all tend to think of sort of online equality as just being on websites, but this will cover smartphones, TV equipment, banking, e-books, e-commerce. And it basically is that any organization, any business providing goods and services to anybody in the EU, wherever it is based. So if we are providing any services or we have colleagues in Europe, you will need to be aware of how you are sending messages. So it's just something to sort of keep at the back of your mind to think about that. And then really, that's it. I'm conscious we've only got 5 minutes instead of 10 minutes for any questions. But is there anything that you think I've missed, or that you would like to know more about, or that you have a particular desire to know more, then now's your chance. Or slip away quietly and go and get 5 minutes back in your day, and hopefully a chance to have a nice cup of tea or a nice cup of coffee. And while I remember, before you do slip away, as Helen kindly reminds me, if you could provide us with some feedback, because it's always really useful for HPCA, the Healthcare Project and Change Association, then giving them feedback. And also on there, you can sort of see some other events that they can do. I can actually recommend going to them and looking for them and seeing how we go from there. So yeah, thank you for your feedback. Thank you for your example, Lisa. Can look into that for you and see if we can do that. And yeah, please share. And if you need to, you can more than happy to contact me and sort of come back to what we're doing. I'll just check if I've got, that's my email address there for those that don't know me. So if you need any further information or want to have a chat or anything like that, then please do give me a call. And thank you for your time. And yes, a recording will be sent out. I think, as Helen said, session will be uploaded to the HPCA's YouTube channel, and you can get the recording from there. And thank you for your time.